think we got probably most people and they might be scooching in. So I'll just quickly do the welcome everybody to federal funding for school-based arts initiatives. And super excited to have my friend and colleague here, Lacey Bohlen, who's just an incredible champion for the arts and arts education. So thank you, Lacey, for being here. I'm with the IAC, so I'm just being the top of the key greeter and providing a little bit of the housekeeping items, which is just to remain muted during the presentation, of course, until Q&A. So you can give any full attention to Lacey, but feel free to use the chat box if you want to introduce yourself or when you have any questions that she can refer to at the end so you don't lose them in your mind space before we get to the end. And feel free to, of course, rename yourself on Zoom, which you can just do so by hovering over your name and selecting the rename option. If you want captioning is available. You just click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your navigation bar. If you have any questions or tech issues, just send a note to the tech host in direct message. And that's basically it. You guys know Zoom at this point, right? So in any event, Lacey, welcome and looking forward to learning from you here today.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which looks eerily similar to your opening slide. So let me go ahead and get that going. Okay, there we go. So thank you so much everyone for joining today. As Paige mentioned, my name is Lacey Bohlen. I currently serve as the state ombudsperson. This is a newer role for me. Previously, I was one of our Title IV grant specialists. Before that, I was in the classroom as an arts educator for 11 years, graduated from Heron School of Art and Design with a degree in arts education. So a little summary of me. And I just kind of want to jump right into my goals for our presentation today. So really the goal of this session is to empower creative leaders to advocate for the arts through knowledgeable conversations regarding federal funding and how federal funding can support the arts, to kind of take a little bit of that scariness out of those conversations. So through this conversation, it's going to have a broader application, applying to anyone from a community organization that provides arts programming, to teaching artists, to art teachers, but the conversations and the information that I'll be presenting are all common themes from multiple conversations I've had while supporting the arts with federal funding. So my goals for today are going to be these three main kind of overarching themes. The first one, how to connect with your audience and kind of demystifying federal funding and how to speak the grant speaks of federal languages. Establishing needs and establishing how you can meet those needs. Basic grant comparison that's going to then lead into a little bit more in detailed grant overview. And then we're going to take an even deeper dive into grants that could be potentially the most impactful for you and that could be the most utilized in the arts space. The last thing is going to be kind of getting your foot in the door with federal funding, next steps, knowing where you fit, and then a little bit of practice at the end just to check for, retention and understanding, bringing back those art education skills or just education in general skills. So to begin with, how to connect with your audience. There's a funny story behind this slide that I kind of want to start with because it's just kind of, setting up the entire atmosphere and conversation that we're about to have. I definitely fell into a rabbit hole when I was looking for images to use throughout my slides because I didn't want to just have a plain slide where just text and text and text and talking and talking and talking. But I was looking for connection and I was looking for, handshakes, and then it was like people wearing gloves and people wearing masks, and I just kind of fell in this rabbit hole. So, and then I remembered IDOE's policy on images and copywriting and all of those things, and just played it safe. And you guys are going to see a lot of little Bitmojis of me throughout this presentation. So just a little mental prep here. But and then we have the elbow bump, which is obviously the safest of the safe. So back to the core subject here is really knowing your audience. And this is kind of just, it's so incredibly aligned with a major takeaway that I had from art school, which is working with a target audience. You have to know and understand who you are creating for and what their needs are. And I really encourage you to use that same mentality when you're approaching these conversations. It's not necessarily about your needs. I mean, ultimately, yes, you as the artist are going to be creating, just as is you and the artist are going to be providing this programming. But you also have to keep in mind the needs of the person who will be consuming this, to really kind of drive those points home. And because of that, you really have to understand what you're talking about, and understand the language, understand the needs, understand the funding sources and different ways that you can kind of troubleshoot. Well, this is the issue that you're running into. Let's find a workaround. Let's see how we can make this happen. So our three main kind of goals within this main section is going to be knowing the language, knowing the audience's needs, and then knowing the funding sources. First section is that demystifying of the grant world and kind of talking about commonly used terminology. My first day at the Indiana Department of Education, back when I was the, new Title IV grant specialist, they handed me, not physically, it was an Excel document, but it was an IDOE glossary. And it is, pages of just these acronyms that we use, definitions that we have, very much everyday language on the state and federal level. Coming from a classroom, I needed that more than anything. I still reference it and I update it and I share it with all of our new hires. It's incredibly important. And I want you all to understand that language as well, because that's one of the first things that's really going to catch people's attention. Oh, well, they're speaking like they have this background in grants and they really understand where they're coming from. Maybe we should pay a little more attention. Maybe we should listen a little more closely so that we can see what they have to offer. So a couple things that I'm just going to review real quickly, because you should have that background knowledge, but also so that when I get talking and I start switching my hat back to the grant specialist or to the ombudsperson, that I don't lose anyone. LEA is basically a fancy term for the district. Okay, local education agency is what LEA stands for. I work at the SEA, which is the state education agency. The SEA receives the funds from the federal U.S. Department of Education and then distributes it to the local education agencies, or the LEAs. A second term that we're going to be using a lot throughout this presentation is a needs assessment. And the needs assessment is an essential part of any grant application where the LEA or whoever's applying, it be a community organization, whatever, identifies their needs through a variety of methods. With most of this, it's done through survey. Sometimes it's done through various meetings with stakeholders. But in almost every grant application, whoever is applying has to say, these are my needs. These are how I've identified my needs. This is what backs that data up. And we're going to talk pretty thoroughly about schools' needs and how arts programming can fit into that, and then how federal funding can support that. TA is our technical assistance. It's built into almost every grant, and it's a set aside amount that the state sets aside for statewide services. So Title IV has a 4% statewide set aside that they can utilize in programming that can support the entire state to support well-rounded education, the arts, things like that. Okay. Formula-based grants versus competitive grants. This is something that we'll be talking about a little in detail as well. Formula-based grants are grants that are based off of a specific formula. They are not competitive. Everybody gets a set slice of the pie, and that's predetermined by usually poverty rate data, attendance rate data, and a couple other things, but those are the two main ones. Competitive grants are typically available to a wider variety of organizations, and they are competitively applied for. They must be reviewed, scored, and are awarded to a limited number of people. Equitable share. Anybody who receives federal funding is going to allocate a portion of their funding towards equitable share. And that's to the non-public schools. They have to offer consultation and offer the funding to the non-public schools. The non-public school may or may not participate, but that offer still has to be made. So that's kind of the overview of the commonly used terms that I'm going to be utilizing and that you kind of want to keep in your back pocket for when you step into those conversations. So let's kind of fast forward a little bit to establishing needs and how we can really dive into those conversations. Now, we all know that I could go on and on about the needs of the arts, the impact of the arts, and how essential they are. And I'm sure that we're going to be talking a lot about that throughout this whole conference. But I also know that I would be preaching to the choir here if I were to do that. I do want to emphasize, though, that impact is especially significant after all of the things that have occurred and have been caused and have continued to be caused throughout the pandemic. And the arts are needed more now than ever. I mean, they always have been needed, but especially now. So bringing this back to establishing needs, you know, as we mentioned in the last slide, all grants, all applicants have to establish their needs. And this is how you want to, this is where you want to take that space up and you want to speak to how your organization can fill those needs. You can support them, how you can meet them, whatever terminology you choose to use. Now is the time to advocate for how your programming can develop skill A through activity B, how incorporating your specific arts programming can increase retention or engagement and attendance. Educators and leaders, really, they already know this, but it's not in the forefront of their minds as we've kind of created this focus on data and scores, which we in the arts area have always kind of felt is irrelevant. But I'm going to challenge this mentality. There is robust data out there. I've attended sessions just on data for the arts and arts programming. And though we all know the impact of arts without the need for, you know, solid data that we're looking at, those who aren't as directly involved with the arts, they may not know that. So I really encourage you to find resources and data that's relevant to your specific programming. If you're a longstanding arts organization or even a new one, I encourage you to start gathering some of your own data and thinking creatively on how your programming can impact learners of all ages. You know, we are forever fighting to prove our relevancy. And I know, and you know, that we are more than relevant and we can offer so much to education, really driving home understanding, engagement, retention, all of the things that the schools are really looking for. But we have to use that data to convince the leaders who are in charge of the funding. So don't be afraid to use it. Don't be afraid to find it and to put it into your conversation. Sorry, next slide. So taking a look at kind of a broader need of data, this is kind of a statewide perspective. This slide is going to feel like a lot of really static numbers and very uninvolved from the arts world. We're talking, this is very heavy in public law, in grant terminology, but again, it's the furthest from that. That data that we just discussed on the previous slide and those outcomes on the impact of the arts that we boasted about, this is where we tie it all together and we make that magic happen. This is where we present that to our audience, whether it be a school that we're trying to partner with, that we're trying to provide services for, or maybe our own leadership team at our own school. The whole point of this is to really inform you and empower you to step into those conversations with that knowledge and assert how the arts can provide positive and meaningful impacts, making sure that you're focusing on the school's needs while you're doing it. So grab your school leader's attention with this knowledge and follow up with the facts correlating how the arts can be meaningful and impactful and can address things like learning loss. Kind of going over some of the information on this slide, and to give you a frame of reference that we're looking at, the American Rescue Plan Act, which is where our ESSER funding came from, we'll dive into that a little bit later, but it was, as the common term goes, an unprecedented amount of funding. In that, in the most recent funding, a mandatory 5% reservation of the grant had to go towards addressing learning loss. So these are intentional funds that are set aside specifically for learning loss. And learning loss is an area that the arts have repeatedly proven that they can affect retention, that they can create that long-lasting impact, and that they can make a difference there. With Public Law 211, 2021, it charged IDOE to conduct a learning loss study. From that study, there were several results that have kind of been filtered out. You can see the whole presentation here. It's a PowerPoint presentation. It's not the whole academic study. I don't even know that I could read through the whole academic study, but the presentation outlines some amazing points and really focuses on the whole purpose and point of the survey. And some of the key takeaways were that the highest impacted subjects were math and language arts. Those are also the most tested subjects. The highest impacted populations that resulted from the survey were the English language learners and students that were receiving special education services. The results also are indicative that other subject areas are likely just as impacted by the pandemic to similar extents. We just don't necessarily have that data because we don't test in that capacity. It also pulled about some conversations about how these issues were pre-existing or existed prior to the pandemic, and then were just kind of exaggerated by the pandemic. So these are state established needs, and these are needs that, though they might seem like a far reach when you get down to the specific math and language arts and thinking about specific populations, really when you start to break things down and when you start to think about programming and how inclusive programming can be and how much we can service our students through the arts, we can start to build those arguments and build those conversations. Additionally, schools are always looking for new ways to improve retention, engagement. I mean, not to mention how strong of an impact the arts have on attendance. All of these are things that schools are consistently looking for. These ones that are outlined on our slide are the ones that they're currently really focused on. So thinking about any programming that you have that might tie to some of those specifically outlined things, learning loss, again, is set aside and emphasized in any of the emergency funds that have been released. But also just thinking about, you know, the impact of the arts and all that data that's out there and tying that all together. Okay, so knowing the funding sources, this is where we're going to start to dive a little bit deeper. We're starting really broad, talking about different federal funding sources. And these are all funding sources that I, in some capacity, have worked with. Maybe not in a whole lot of detail, or maybe something that I've worked quite detailed with. Title I, and this grid kind of breaks it down. So we have the different titles listed across the top: Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV. Those are our kind of most commonly spoken of. And then we have RLIS, 21st Century, and then ESSERS 1 through 3, which those are the emergency funding that's really going to focus on addressing learning loss. This is kind of a brief breakdown of their overarching goals. So Title IV, well-rounded educational supports, that's going to be what we would focus most on, but it also focuses on social emotional learning, school safety, and it also focuses on integrating technology. Also can be very applicable to the arts, which we'll talk about shortly. This column right here, or row, says the length of the grant. So some of the grants are 12 months, some are 27. You can see that the 21st Century is actually a 4-year grant. This will let you know if it's formula-based or if it's competitively awarded. And then this last column is kind of creative ways that we could utilize it for the arts. So you can see Title II, for example, professional development for educators, prepping them for having teaching artists in the classroom. That would be an excellent use of Title II funds. Title III, English learning specific arts related programming. I spoke with our Title III kind of main contact person who's over EL and migrant learning as well. And he was saying that he's seen some really cool art therapy that has been put into place with Title III funds. We'll talk about Title IV. It's my favorite. I will have to control how much I talk about Title IV. RLIS for the rural and low income schools supports. It can be used to support any of these funding streams, Title I, II, or IV. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about 21st Century. There's a lot of amazing opportunities there, and as well as ESSER 1 through 3. We're just going to kind of talk about them as a whole because it would be too much to try to break them down individually, and they're very similar anyways. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper and let's look into grants overview and information. We are going to specifically start talking about Title II, IV, 21st Century, ESSER, and then I'm going to throw a curveball in. I'm going to throw EANS in, which has been my life for the past couple of months. So I have some great ideas to go for that as well. Starting with Title II. Title II funding focuses on professional development for staff. So you would consider programming that your organization may offer that provides professional development to educators regarding the arts. This could be general educators regarding arts integration. It could also be what I had mentioned previously, where we're thinking about maybe prepping for having a teaching artist and how we can use some professional development to prepare our teachers. Or there could be professional development that was specifically aimed at arts educators. I know when I first started teaching, there was an arts coordinator for the school that I taught at, and they lined up professional development specifically for the visual arts teachers, specifically for the theater teachers, specifically for the music education teachers. So all of that could be with Title II funds. It's professional development and still very relevant to the arts. Next, we're going to dive into Title IV, my favorite. And as you can see here, it says you can do all things through Title IV. So maybe not all things, but Title IV is likely your best bet for supporting the arts. Disclaimer here, before we proceed too far, all grants have this fun little clause that's called supplement, not supplant, which just means that you can utilize federal funds to support programming, but you can't replace that programming with federal funds. So for example, if you had a music teacher and you wanted to add another music teacher, if that additional music teacher was above and beyond the requirements, then Title IV could easily pay for that because you are supplementing, you are not supplanting. However, if you have just your one music teacher position, it's a mandatory position, and it has previously been paid for with general funds, then we run into issues. So I know that conversation gets a little more nitty gritty into the school side of things. And so for our intents and purposes in this conversation, I think we're going to leave the overview at that. But if you have any further questions, please feel free to ask me. I'd be more than happy to dive in. It gets a little fuzzy in places, as federal funds do, but it's always a fun conversation to have. Title IV is a smaller grant, but it does have a minimum allocation of $10,000, which means that each eligible LEA, to be eligible, the school district would have previously needed to be eligible for Title I, but each eligible LEA receives at least $10,000 to support Title IV activities and programming. And they can choose to, if they choose to apply for that, and they can choose to do anything within the 3 focus areas that we are going to discuss next. Most LEAs do apply. However, there are a couple outliers out there. So let's take a closer look at exactly what that means. Title IV is an annually awarded 27-month federally funded grant rooting from ESEA and is broken down into 3 main focus areas: well-rounded education, safe and healthy schools, and the effective use of technology. Being that this is a 27-month grant and is annually awarded, schools will always have some overlap with their Title IV grants, meaning more than one Title IV grant will be running at a time. Currently, the US Department of Education granted IDOE an extra year to spend down their FFY19 funding. And that was simply because there was so much money remaining, which is an issue that I'm sure we would love to resolve, especially with the arts. So this means that districts right now have FFY19, FFY20, which was last year's, and soon to be FFY21 open. FFY, by the way, just means federal fiscal year. One thing that I do want to mention is that these grants can be amended. A school could request to submit a change, and though they may have allocated all of their Title IV funding for one area, with a pretty simple process, they can actually change what they're requesting. So it's never too late to ask. I also wanted to mention that all of the allocations are public information. So let's say you're working predominantly in Central Indiana and you want to get an idea of how much funding is allocated for Title IV. That can be accessed on the in.gov website. Real quickly before we move on, I just wanted to point out this lovely little graphic. This graphic breaks down those focus areas a little bit more. And what you'll see is you'll find that initially, when looking at this, arts fit specifically into well-rounded education. I made sure to include fine arts in the little blurb that's under that, as it's a key component of a well-rounded education. However, the arts also fit into focus area B and focus area C. Those, arts education and safe and healthy schools, thinking about schools and their social emotional learning and tying the arts and social emotional learning together, that can fall into focus area B. You also think about all of the wonderful technology and integration that you can have with the arts and technology, and that can fall into focus area C. I wanted to provide you with a couple examples of arts programming funded through Title IV. So you can see a couple items that are listed here: drumming programs incorporating SEL, arts, music, and theater supplies, after-school arts programming, songwriting workshops, filmmaking workshops, teaching artists have been funded with Title IV, arts therapy. You could pay for an arts coordinator. There's a plethora of things that you could do with Title IV. So what I'm going to ask for you to do real quickly, we're going to get a little more involved because I've been talking for quite some time now. So let's take a little break and let's throw some ideas into the chat for how you think that Title IV programming could be used to support the arts, whether it's your programming or maybe a local school, maybe you're a teaching artist and want to throw some ideas out there. Just go ahead and throw those in. I will say that I'm not currently going to monitor the chat just because I have too many things going on and not enough screens, but I will come back and check at the end and we'll maybe pick this conversation back up. So just take a couple minutes and think about some of the ways, some ideas that might have been sparked by some of the conversations that we've had for how Title IV funding could potentially support some of your programming. All right, as we are entering those wonderful ideas in, I will slowly move, make sure that I do the teacher wait time, to the 21st century slide. well, 21st CCLC. My apologies. Jumping into this a little bit, this grant is different than the other grants that we've talked about in the fact that it is a competitive grant. So it's not just everybody gets their own piece of the pie. This is submitting an application as a competitive application, and it can be awarded to either community-based organizations or to LEAs, so our local education agencies. The thing that I absolutely love about 21st Century is that they are forever and always emphasizing these really robust out of school time programming that encourages creativity, college and career readiness, well-rounded education. I mean, they do everything. And they typically have, I mean, if I'm completely honest, they're typically ahead of the ball, at the tip of the precipice of an idea that is just coming into play into the rest of the community, to the rest of the world. I have nothing but respect for this grant, and they do amazing work. Some of the ways that you could potentially become involved with this is I have provided a listing of existing 21st Century programs that are already established. Remember, this is a 4-year grant. So you could consider possibly working with an already established program, finding out what works for them, or you could possibly consider applying if you have the capacity to. They do have a lot of, we'll say, guidelines where you have to have students, they have to attend so many times. So this is definitely more of a setting where you would be serving students regularly, and which is why schools tend to get it, or community-based organizations like after school programs, things like that. But don't ever be discouraged from reaching out and reaching for things that might not initially seem feasible, because the one thing that I found working at the Department of Education is that we really try to be flexible, and we really try to think, well, how could this work? If somebody presents us with an idea that we haven't heard of before, what are some creative ways we could think about potentially making that work? If you want a little bit more information about out of school time, you can find a little link right here, or there's the after school implementation guide that's right here. And I had links like that on my other slides as well. I just forgot to call them out, but on the presentation that I will be loading so that it is accessible, you can click on those links. It'll take you to Title II page, Title IV page, and the remaining pages as well. So moving on to ESSER. So we have 2 more grants to go through, and I'm gonna kind of go through this one quickly because all of the other grants have basically built up to this grant. ESSER is very, very broad. I wanted to say it's essentially all of the other grants built on top of one another, and it kind of is. But anything that you request through ESSER funding has to be rooted out of a need that was created from or because of the pandemic. So wording is incredibly important here, and justification is key for your requests. Let's say that you have a need for additional instruments. Working with your school or working with whoever would request this, you're not just going to write, we want 6 tubas. You're going to say, to mitigate the spread of COVID, we need additional instruments for our class to reduce sharing, especially thinking about instruments that might have mouthpieces. You could also discuss how it's less expensive to purchase more instruments than to continue cleaning between each class. And then also just talking about how that's not necessarily a reasonable expectation. And just being mindful of your wording and making sure that you're rooting that back. So again, when you approach these conversations, if you want to talk about, hey, I know that schools received this emergency relief funding, which is the ESSER funding, and I know that it can be utilized for things that are approvable with Title IV, because if you look at this little screenshot right here, remember I said that Title IV, well, Title I, II, III, and IV are all based out of ESEA or ESSA. I know that those are all approvable. Here's how I think this would work. So just kind of thinking through that space and making sure that you're very conscious of your wording when you make those propositions. One other thing that I wanted to point out is the reason why I'm, again, giving you all of this information and all this knowledge is to empower you to be able to have these conversations. So don't limit yourself in your research. It's always better to go into a situation knowing more than enough and not quite enough. And this website, I've kind of designed it so that it gives you talking points. It gives you those starting points. So when you're looking, this 4, 5, and 6, these little yellow circles right here on the actual website itself, if I were to click on that, it opens it up. I created it so that it opens up into kind of like a thinking space, and it asks some leading questions. You'll definitely see throughout some of them, there are some, how could this be utilized on something that would support well-rounded education? I know in the after school space, I questioned how is your out of school time supports different from your school time supports, because, if they're not retaining the information in the classroom because of the methods or whatever else, then what are we doing additionally to help that retention? Are we making it more engaging by including the arts? So talking through things like that with leadership to help them get to the understanding that the arts really do bring invaluable amounts of all aspects of learning to the table. So real quickly, let's jump on over to EANS. Like I mentioned previously, EANS is the beast that I've been working with, kind of trying to tackle and to try to understand. EANS is the emergency assistance to non-public schools. So this is different in the fact that it is going directly to non-public schools. And that definitely changes how we play the game a little bit. And I'm going to talk about this more later, but the non-public schools don't actually purchase and reimburse through IDOE. They utilize a service that we contracted with called Class Wallet. And in order for them to utilize EANS funding, they have to purchase from an IDOE approved EANS vendor. So I'm going to touch on this in just a second, but if you're an organization that offers programming that could be after school programming, that could be in-school programming, anything that works with students, enrichment programming, all of that could be supported through EANS funding. And I'll talk about how you can register as a vendor here in just a minute. One thing that I did want to mention is that with EANS funding, they're much more limited because they are going to non-public schools, but we're starting to understand the potential. So first we kind of had to understand the beast, and now we're starting to get creative with it. And that's, just kind of how things work. You have to understand something before you can really grow and expand upon it. And that's now the point that we're at. So our first round for EANS 1 was just over $80 million. And we allocated that to all of the non-public schools. Non-public schools at this point have spent about half of that money. So there's still a considerable amount out there. Might be worth starting those conversations. And then we're in the process of applying for EANS 2, which is going to be just over $78 million. So lots of millions of dollars that non-public schools will be working with. And the two areas that I wanted to emphasize where the arts would fall in would be 2, for redeveloping instructional plans for remote or hybrid learning or to address learning loss, and 12, which is initiating and maintaining education or support services that could also address learning loss. Those are the two main areas where we have approved arts programming to support. So you'll notice those both say allowable but not reimbursable as like a disclaimer. All that means is that the schools can purchase that programming through Class Wallet, but they cannot directly purchase it themselves and then request reimbursement. And I can get more into that if you would like later. But the key for this kind of purpose is that we focus on purchasing through Class Wallet, which means that whoever, let's say the non-public school wants to purchase arts programming from a local arts organization to come in and support their out of school time programming. So after school programming, they want to work with their students, even social emotional learning supports, and bringing social emotional learning to an after school space, working with the non-public students. What they would then do is they would go, I have a vendor listing, so they can search for after school programming and they can search for all these other things, and they would then purchase that through Class Wallet, which is a separate platform that we've partnered with. It's pretty, well, for state standards, it's pretty quick and easy to apply to become a vendor. But it is a little tedious in the fact that, you know, you do have to have some, you have to have a DUNS number and you have to be registered, which are all things that you can do within about a week or two. It's just getting it done. So I've provided the link for more EANS information. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, bring that conversation to the table. And then I have also provided the link if you would like to become an EANS vendor, at least apply and see where it takes you. Get yourself in that little registration so that you can have your services available to schools. And I'm still very much in the development phases for EANS. The funding will be good until 2024 for EANS 2 and 2023 for EANS 2, EANS 1. So lots of time to kind of figure things out. But I am coming up with different ways that I can kind of promote those creative uses of funding, which is something I have become a little notorious for at the state. Okay, now to our final section, getting your foot in the door with federal funding. The most important thing is knowing where you fit. And this slide's a little wordy, and I apologize for that, but it really gets out everything that I want to say. There are two separate ways that arts organization, arts teachers, anybody in the community that is working with arts and with schools can utilize that funding. The first is through utilizing grant funds that are allocated to schools. So that's that federal funding that we just discussed, Titles 1, 2, 3, 4. When it's awarded to your schools, working with your schools and figuring out what they need and figuring out what you provide can directly support their needs. So basically that whole conversation that I just had can be narrowed down into this number one bullet point right here, where you're working with schools to utilize your services to support the arts in their buildings, figuring out what their needs are and supporting their needs through your programming. The second way is through a contracted partnership with the state. So this is a larger scale because it's statewide technical assistance. So it goes back to that TA word that I was talking about, where it's that set aside that every grant has. This is a lengthy process. We have to go through RFPs, we have to go through procurement, we have to go through all sorts of things, but it has been utilized for some amazing programming. I utilized our Title IV set aside to create the social emotional learning through the arts kind of crosswalk, as well as implementing Bring Change to Mind programming across the state. So schools have free programming through Bring Change to Mind because of a partnership that happened between IDOE and Bring Change to Mind. And if you don't know what Bring Change to Mind is, it's an anti-stigma after school club that goes into schools and essentially grants them mini grants. And then the schools have conversations about mental health, just being able to talk about that without having stigma. It's really amazing programming. But again, statewide, large scale. Another thing that you want to do, and I know that I've harped on this a million times, but it is essential if you want administration to listen, if you want whoever you're pitching your programming to listen, you need to be sure to stay focused on their needs, just like back in art school where you had your target audience and you had to build your design towards your target audience. Be sure to include that key vocabulary. Keep this PowerPoint, reference it, look at those words, visit those websites, really build that capacity within yourself. And then be sure to know your current school's needs and advocate for how your programming can address those needs. Also keeping in mind that needs change. They change with location, with time, just about anything can change. So keep in touch with those local needs. Statewide needs are always important, but on a local level, the people that you're having this conversation with, they're going to want to know that you know that information, but they're also going to have very, very specific needs of their own, which they should be aware of because they have to repeatedly repeat them in all of their grant applications. And I'm going to say it again, data. I know that that's sometimes a bad word when it comes to the arts world, but I think that we've proven here that that data exists. And I'm not talking about test score data. I'm not talking about that, fill in the bubble data. I'm talking about seeing correspondence. I'm talking about how arts increases engagement. I'm talking about how arts increases attendance. When I was an art educator, I had students pulled specifically from my classroom because I was the only class that they were attending. And it wasn't because I was a cool teacher, even though I like to think that I was. It was most definitely because the arts are engaging. It's hands-on, it's creating, it's what people need for a well-rounded education. Okay, let's proceed. And then also be heard. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to, shoot your shot and go as far as you can go, but also know who to talk to, stay connected. Don't give up, work to network. This conference is a wonderful example of, really utilizing that networking space. And then also utilize the smaller things like the Title IV resource guide that we've created. One of the things that we've noticed in the state is that one school shares with another school, and then all of a sudden, we have things like Project Lead the Way, which is amazing programming, but that's an Indiana-based program that has exploded to nationwide. And it's basically because it started with one school and then it just kind of traveled through. All right, so this is the last slide that I'm going to be doing a lot of talking, and then we're going to kind of jump into what I'm going to call practice time. But I do want you to think about one last thing when you're discussing these things with, your schools, your administration, whoever you might be having this conversation with. And I want you to think about your allowability. What is it going to take to make your programming fundable and allowable? And so think about which funds best support your programming. Name it when you're discussing your programming, because that really directs that conversation. And it also really lets the person that you're talking to know that, you've been empowered with this information. You can have these conversations. You deserve the seat at the table. Point to evidence of allowability. Again, just having your name listed in the Title IV resource guide saying, this, you can't say that the state is recommending this, but you can say that the state has determined that this has vetted this process and it is allowable. And then the last thing is just kind of bear in mind the capacity of the people that you're working with. And I don't mean your organization here, I mean the school itself. A lot of schools are really scrambling right now. They are overwhelmed. We thought last year was a bad year. This year is equally as rough. I don't know if I can say anything is equally as rough as what last year was for educators, but there's still a lot going on. So a lot of times it's hard to try something new when you're feeling overwhelmed. So providing as much evidence as possible, providing as much support as possible, and also always just speaking with that patience. Okay, the last couple slides are going to be some practice. So I've created a couple scenarios, and I thought we could just kind of think through these scenarios and let me know what your responses are. So our first scenario is, and I think that we can utilize the chat for this, though I'm not sure that I currently have the chat up. I think it would also be appropriate to unmute and say your response as well. So the first scenario, is you're a local arts organization wanting to provide your programming to schools in your area. You currently lack the capacity to work statewide, but you do have the capacity to provide after-school programming throughout the school day for students, and professional development. So just kind of thinking through the things that we've discussed, the funding lines that we've discussed, what funding line do you think would best support your needs? So thinking about like Title 1, 2, 3, 4, I can hop back to that slide too if we think. I'll give you a couple seconds to review this. Nobody told you there'd be a pop quiz at the end.
I'm gonna jump in and say Title IV. Since you said everything was Title IV?
Title 4 is always a good answer. Yeah, so going back and looking at what we have for our scenario, Title 4 would definitely be a potential. Working with your school would be the key here. You wouldn't want to try and contract with the state because you don't necessarily yet have the capacity to work statewide, as that's stated in the second bullet. So you could use Title 2 for your professional development. You could work possibly with the out of school time or 21st century to do any after school, but Title 4 would cover all of those things. They would cover the professional development. It would cover the after school programming with the arts, absolutely all of those things. Okay, here's my favorite one because I was this person. Scenario 2, you are an arts educator and you have been advocating and just can't seem to get any footing for this programming that you want to implement. What are your potential next steps?
You know, we should probably just say we're really patient. We could run out of time. It's 4:23. We end at 4:30. Come on. Come on, people. I say I would call you. I'd be like, Lacey, I need help.
That's actually a good tie-in because I did just have somebody say, and I'm jumping into the questions where it says, who is the right person to talk to regarding fitting our programming into the Title IV grants? That would be me, or you could also talk to Laura Blades, who's an awesome contact. Alma is coming on board as well, but you can definitely message me. I believe I have my email listed at the end. So yes, so the next steps for the scenario would be to research and find your resources. Find out how much your school is allocated. So go to that website, go to the Title IV website, find how much is allocated to Title IV, use your Title IV resource guide to say, hey, I see that, you know, we've been allocated $25,000 for Title IV. There's this programming listed in the resource guide, meaning it's already been approved. So I know that I can use this, it's allowable. Find some data on how that programming, or ask the organization if it's, you know, an after school program or an arts program, you know, ask them for that data. I want this to be utilized in our school. What data can I give my administration? And then the last one that I was going to say is reach out to me and ask me. So I know we have 5 minutes left. This is my last scenario, and then it's my thank you slide. And I am going to try and glance at these questions that are in here real quickly. But scenario 3 is that you are a well-established local arts organization that have the capacity to work statewide. Currently, you have an idea or a concept that could be utilized at state level, and you have previously worked to implement this programming on a smaller scale to gauge its effectiveness and impact. You have data raring and ready to go. Yes. Thank you, Gretchen. Apply for vendor status. Definitely. You can use the IDOE EANS and then apply for the vendor status. and your programming could be used, that could be used in the previous scenario as well if you're an arts organization. But also this scenario, utilizing that EANS funding, getting a little slice of that pie by registering as an IDOE EANS vendor, and then advocating for your programming through that. You'd also get listed in the IDOE EANS vendor resource guide, which is then going to tell schools, hey, they're already approved. All you have to do is send them a check. I mean, they'll email you first, but you get notified through class once. It's a little more complicated, but. Another thing that you can do with this last scenario is you can work to contract with the state, and that would be reaching out to me, promoting that programming, and seeing where it leads you. You know, there is a limited amount of funding. It's not like we have money flowing out of our pockets in every direction, but we do have some excess funding that has come from emergency funds and also just from schools not spending down their funding because of the pandemic. So never be afraid to reach and to ask and to reach out to me and see where it can take you. So I'm going to go to my final slide, and then I'm going to try and scroll through some of these questions and see if anybody has any questions, and I apologize for not leaving more time at the end. So just working backwards, Kay had a great question. She asked if we can access any Title IV funds directly, or must it be initiated by the school districts? So the federal funding all has to go to the school first, and then it gets distributed. The only scenario in which that is different is with the 21st century or 21st CCLC funding. And that can be applied for by an organization. So if you have the capacity to do after school programming. But all other funds would go through the school first. So another great question from Jeff, thinking about the person to talk to in your district. Let's say that you are that educator in scenario 3 and you don't really, maybe you're just not talking to the right person. One thing that I would recommend doing is finding out who writes your grants. Every school is different. Some school has the same person write all of their federal grants. Some schools have a Title I person, a Title II person, a Title III person, and a Title IV person. If that was the scenario, I would find the person who is most relevant to the grant that you're looking for. So for example, Title IV, finding out who that person is. It would probably always be wise of you to start at the administration level, but typically we see grants submitted by specific grant writers, and those grant writers should be having conversations ongoing and regular for their needs assessment purposes with all of the principals and administrators in all of their buildings. I'm just going to address this one last question real quickly, and I'm honestly not sure if I can fully answer it, but Gretchen asked if an independent artist can provide services through Title IV, or if they must be a 501(c)(3). And to that, I would respond, if that's kind of up to who your school is working with. So again, it can't go directly to the person or the organization, but if you were to work with a school who would work with you as an independent artist to come in and perhaps work on a project with the students, or maybe even create artwork for the school itself, then absolutely. Yeah, Paige, I'm gonna put my slideshow in the link in my presentation box. I forgot to do that.
There's a presentation. Oh, just in, do you have like a link, or do you upload it or something?
Yeah, you upload it with your little profile. So I'm going to put that up there. Yeah. I meant to
Cool.
do it before, but my daughter needed my attention.
Oh, it's usually one, the daughter, the cat, or the dog, one of the three generally. Well, great. We'll let you do that before we break out because you and I are going to be on the little federal funding meetup. So if you guys have more questions and want to get a little bit more clarity on this stuff, we certainly welcome you to hop on over to that meetup, and Lacey would be happy to provide more guidance. So that would be great.